This is the fourth of a series of video tutorials on creating Rhino plugins that use the UMI framework. In this tutorial, we'll be learning about how you can use the UMI database to persist simulation results within a bundle. In the previous tutorial, a new UMI simulation panel provided the user with the ability to dynamically inspect buildings for their simulation results, but required that the simulation be rerun every time the project was opened. The UMI database can be used to avoid this step. First, let's learn how to store simulation results to the database. We will store the results immediately after they're calculated in our calculation command. Here it is. The data structure that is used to store data in the database is called an IUMI object. At the beginning of our command, once we know a project is open, we'll create an empty list of these objects. You'll need to use Control period to get them. Then, once we're done calculating everything, we'll save those objects to the database using the UMI context. Context.storeObjects is the method that is used to save information to the database. Each time we calculate a transit carbon value, we'll create a new object for it. How do we do that? Data in the UMI database is stored in a set of data series. In many cases, like this one, the data series only has one number in it, but you can also use it if you want to do actual time series data. First, let's create the series. Each data series has a name and units, although the units are optional. In this case, they make sense. And of course, the actual data themselves. In this case, once again, it's a single element array, just a single transit carbon value. Once we have the series, we can create an actual database object to store it. And that object has a name, which is just the building name, and an object ID, which is just a building ID, although we have to convert it to a string from a GUID. And finally, the actual data series. Once we have this object, we can add it to our list of objects. Now, whenever we run this command, we'll save data to the database. Let's see it in action. First, we open our project. We go to our new panel and run the simulation. Now, you can use the results viewer to make sure that the data were actually saved in the database. This, of course, is non-series data. When the series only has one element, it's considered not a series. And you can see transit carbon got added. There are 2 data points. There's our office building and our retail building. The viewer isn't really pretty, but it's useful for this, to make sure that the data that you want to be in the database actually made it there. So now we're saving data to the database. Make sure you save your project so we can test retrieving it later, and then close Rhino. The second half of the equation is figuring out how to get the data out of the database. We want to do this so that the user doesn't have to run the simulation manually every time they open a new project. We just want to load it automatically when the project is loaded. Now, we're already doing something very similar. You'll remember we're loading the simulation settings when the project is loaded, and that happens in the plugin file. To review, when our plugin loads, it sets up an event listener on umieventsource.instance.projectOpened. Whenever this happens, whenever a new project is opened, it calls this method, instanceProjectOpened, which is down here. All that method does is load settings. We're going to add another method here that, in addition to loading settings, loads the actual data for the buildings. So let's create that method. Let's call it loadResults. And it will also load results out of an UMI context. This will be the new context for whatever project is getting loaded. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get all the objects out of the UMI context. This will get all the objects in the database. For each one, we're going to see if that object has the data series that we care about, because these objects have every data series for every UMI module. We only care about our own data. So we'll say if the object data contains our key, then we're going to do something with it. Specifically, we're going to get the ID, and we have to convert it back from a string into a proper GUID. And then we're going to store that in that temporary results dictionary that you remember we created. And this is what the simulation panel uses to do its dynamic updates. Of course, we have to get the actual data out of the database object. And this says get the first element out of that data series. And there's only one element, so that's the one we want. And this will just store that in the results dictionary. So now we need to make sure this method is called when a new project is opened, which means we just go down here to instance project opened, and we add it. So now whenever a project is opened, this will get run, and it will load all this data out of the database and put it in this dictionary, which is then used by the panel to update dynamically. Let's see it in action. So remember, we already saved the data for the simulation we ran. We shouldn't need to run it again to get it to automatically show up in the panel. Let's see if it worked. Looks like it did. So that's a quick overview of how to use the UMI database to save data and load it back again.